Fungi, plants, and animals. So we're going to look at these three different kingdoms. Spend a bit more time on the animal kingdom. First off, though, the fungi kingdom. So these guys are multicellular, they're eukaryotes, and they are also heterotrophic, meaning they eat other organisms. They don't make their own food, not like plants that are able to make their own food. Saprobes, so they absorb nutrients from their environment. They break down dead or decaying matter. This is why you see fungi growing on things like dead trees, or where there's maybe dead roots underground. You'll be able to see them growing. And they are able to produce sexually or asexually, depending on what type of life cycle they're going through. Structures, most fungi contain these things called hyphae. And they are thread-like filaments. So essentially most of the fungi structure is going to be these long filaments that grow all over the place. We normally think of a fungus as, say, like a mushroom, and that's actually the fruiting body. So the mushrooms that you see growing, they are the fruiting bodies that grow up from these hyphae that are further underground, absorbing all of the nutrients. And it's only when the fungus is going to reproduce that they produce these fruiting bodies that you see that we recognize as mushrooms. So mycelium is used to absorb those nutrients. And again, here's a picture of the growth of those filaments within the dead or decaying matter, where they can essentially absorb all the nutrients from them. The cell wall of these is made from chitin. So unlike plants who build their cell walls out of cellulose, these organisms, this entire kingdom, is going to be using a different type of molecule to build its structure. And then you can get a texture for that when you eat a mushroom versus eating a piece of celery. You get an idea as to some of the differences in structures between these different organisms. Reproduction, again, they can reproduce asexually by budding or binary fission. So essentially where you have the organism and it's able to separate off a piece of it would be budding. So you have a small piece coming off a large mass of the fungi, or by binary fission, if they're very small, they can split in half. Fragmentation can also work. So if you have some filaments living in your garden and you dig up some part of earth, you may be fragmenting those filaments, breaking them off, and you can go put them somewhere else and they'll be able to continue to grow. So they can do this asexual reproduction life cycle where they are able to produce spores, and these spores can float through the air and they last a really long time. They can land on things and then start growing again. So that's the asexual reproduction cycle. Or they can go through a more complicated process where they are going to actually be producing haploid cells, where those haploid cells are going to be able to combine together in a new form of a zygote, which will allow for more genetic combination between two different unrelated species. Same members of the species, but not the same organism itself, are able to combine their genomes and create a new combination, which would be a new member of that particular species. All right, symbiotic relationships. One of the big roles that these guys have is you can see them working alongside of bacteria, so cyanobacteria that are able to gather sunlight energy, and the fungi themselves are able to produce essentially a structure where the cyanobacteria are able to live. And so the fungi give the cyanobacteria a place to live, and the cyanobacteria give the fungi some nutrients to live off of. And anytime you look at a bark of a tree, you'll see that there are the lichen growing on the barks of trees or rocks all over the place. These are a symbiotic relationship. So lichen itself is not one organism. It is a combination of two different organisms and actually two different kingdoms living symbiotically together. And mycorrhizae is another symbiotic relationship the fungi have, but this one is with the plant kingdom. A lot of plants are dependent on fungi in order to get nutrients, and so things like legumes, beans, they are able to create this relationship with fungi where the fungi captures the nitrogen, or it's supposed to be nitrogen, N2 out of the air, and the fungi is able to trap it in the form of nitrate, which then the plant can use as fertilizer. And so the plant gets nutrients from the fungi, and the fungi again get a place to live and get food from that relationship with the plant, who's able to get energy from the sun. Plant kingdom. So again, very diverse kingdom. Here's a picture of a giant flower, which is kind of neat. The unfortunate thing about it for humans is that it relies on flies to pollinate it, and one way to attract flies is to smell not like roses, but like rotting flesh. So earliest plants appeared 500 million years ago, and we think that they have come from algae. So algae have some of the similar structures in terms of being autotrophic. They're able to gather energy from the sun. And so when we look at the chloroplasts found within plants, it looks like they have come from algae ancestors, and huge number of species, of which we are very good at eliminating them. We like to grow certain types of plants and not allow other ones to grow. And so with our clearing of the land and agriculture, we have eliminated a lot of plant species, or close to eliminating a lot of plant species. Characteristics, so again, definitely multicellular eukaryotic, and unlike fungi that use chitin, these guys use cellulose to build their cells walls and give them structure. Autotrophic in that they gather energy from the sun, and again, they have several ways of reproduction. They can reproduce sexually or asexually depending on the plant, and most of them are terrestrial, so they tend to be land-based. Not that there aren't some aquatic plants, but they tend to do quite well in terrestrial surfaces, and even the aquatic ones tend to be relatively close to the shore of the aquatic body. They still do require light, and it seems that protists and algae tend to do quite well on water. Plants do much better on land. If they do want to live in the water, they have to adapt in particular ways in terms of getting access to air and keeping water in. So keeping water in on land is no problem. They use a waxy cuticle. So essentially their leaves are covered with this waxy layer, and you can see this on a lot of plants. That essentially traps the water in. When it rains, you can see that the water also gets trapped out of the plant. They don't tend to absorb a huge amount of water through their leaves, but they are able to store and save the water from leaving their leaves by having the waxy cuticle. And they have the stomata, which is where the air comes in. So if they're taking in let's say CO2, and they're taking that into their cells, they're able to bring it into their leaves through these stomata, and they're able to open and close them to prevent water loss. So if it's very dry conditions, they will keep them closed. Otherwise, they can open them up to let air pass in and out. All right, 4 major groups. The bryophytes, so these are, I think, mosses. So we have plants that are similar to mosses. They don't have very much vascular tissue. And then we have ferns. These guys here, they don't produce flowers. We have gymnosperms, which most people would call conifers. So things like pine trees and spruce trees. And then we have angiosperms, and these are flowering plants. So if you see plants with flowers on them, they belong to that 4th angiosperm group. In terms of the characteristics, so if we look at a cladogram for these guys, the mosses don't really have vascular tissue, and what that is essentially tubes to carry fluid around. So when you look at a leaf, you can see the veins on the leaf. Mosses don't have those, so that developed later on. Ferns don't produce seeds. They reproduce through spores. So the development of seeds is something that came after ferns branched off. Both conifers and the angiosperms produce seeds, and the angiosperms are the ones that produce flowers. You don't see flowers on things like pine trees or spruce trees. So seed producing developed later, and vascular systems came before that, and then very at the beginning, getting close to what algae would look like, we have the non-vascular plants in terms of moss. All right, the big one, the animal kingdom. Not that there is more organisms in the animal kingdom than the other ones, but definitely these are the ones we like to focus on because they are interesting to us, and of course we're in this kingdom too. So these guys are definitely all going to be multicellular. Eukaryotic cells, so big complicated cells, but they don't have a cell wall. So this is what's different from plant cells and fungi cells and animal cells. Plant cells have a cellulose cell wall, fungi have a chitin cell wall, and animal cells have no cell wall. Heterotrophic, unlike plants, animals cannot produce their own food. And they have very specialized organization to their tissues. And we'll see as we go through the different groups within the kingdom of animals, the different phylums, they tend to be specialized into certain types of tissues depending on which phylum we're talking about. Most reproduce sexually, and so at some point they produce what's called a diploid cell. So it's a cell that only has half the genetic information that has to combine with another cell that has another half, so that has half, and another cell that has half the genetic information, and they will combine to produce a new full individual with a full genome. Most of these guys tend to be mobile, definitely at some point in their lifetime, but unlike plants and fungi, which are quite sessile, these guys actually, because of their self-specialization and their different tissue types, tend to be able to move around. And as we are heterotrophics, specifically, they're going to be using food from other organisms, but they're going to be combining that with oxygen in order to do their metabolism. So we're going to look at the basis for distinguishing the different phyla. So the animal kingdom is broken up into several phyla. The difference to separate those phyla is based on these three things here. So functional cell groups, so there's different layers. There's the ectoderm, and it has that prefix ecto, derm talking about layer. So this is talking about the outer layer. This tends to develop into things like the shells or the feathers or the hair on the outside. The mesoderm, so the middle layer. This tends to develop into the tissue that is associated with like the muscular system or the circulatory system. And then there's the endoderm. This is the inner layer, and this is essentially the lining that we see inside. So animals are often referred to as sort of a tube within a tube. So you imagine a tube, and inside that tube there is another tube, and that's a very common sort of structure for animals. And we could think of the outer layer as being the outside of that tube. The middle layer is the stuff that goes in the middle, like the nervous tissue and that sort of thing. And then the endoderm is the lining of that inner tube. And so things like food essentially would be passing through that inner tube. Don't want to get this picture too graphic, but essentially if you think of animals as a tube within a tube, that's essentially how they're able to get their nutrition. All right, the body symmetry is another way. We want to look at these two types. So radially symmetrical means that if you were to sort of draw a line through the middle, no matter where you drew that line, one side would be the same as the other. So if we looked at this side here, it would be the same as the other side there. So they're symmetrical any way you draw your line around the body. Then we have bilaterally symmetrical, and this is where if we were to draw a line in one particular way, one side is the same as the other. So they are symmetrical along one line, but not around the other one. So the other one would be not symmetrical, but say the left and the right side are going to be symmetrical. And then the body cavity, based on, we won't get into the details of this, it gets too much embryology type stuff, but essentially when the different parts of the body develop is another way of classifying them. And then there's this coelom that is able to be used to distinguish between the different phylums. Again, not something we're going to focus on, but it is important for the animals, is important for organ growth and placement and protection. All right, so we're going to quickly go through a few points about each of the main animal phylums. And again, you may see a slightly different division depending on which sources you're using, but these are sort of the main ones here. So if we look at these 10, you recognize probably several of them. We're going to look at each one of these phylums, but this is essentially the entire animal kingdom broken up into the 10 different phylums. First one is the sponges. And so if you look at these porifera, these guys here, they don't have any nerves, relatively simplistic, probably the most simplistic amongst the phylum of the animal kingdom. Then we have the cnidarians, and they are radially symmetrical at some point in their life, but do have more complexity. Let's just go back that last one. So lobsters are not part of that phylum. They're going to show up over here. These guys here, they are the rest of them, the other 8, are going to be broken up into protozomes or deuterozomes, and essentially that is based on when their digestive system develops and how it develops. And so a fun fact is the 2 groups that you're probably quite familiar with actually are deuterozomes, and during development the anus actually forms before the mouth, as opposed to protozomes where the mouth forms first. But another way of separating the groups from each other. All right, let's look at sponges first. So Phylum Porifera. These are very simple animals, no nerves. They're asymmetrical completely, so they don't have any symmetry to them. No particularly defined shapes. It just depends on how they grow. The water is able to pass, so these are aquatic, the water is able to pass through the animal's tissue, and they are sessile while they're adults anyways. While they're young, they are free floating, and then they land somewhere, and then they spend the rest of their life in that one spot. So, you know, SpongeBob is not an adult. Then the cnidarians, these are your jellyfishes, but they're also going to include corals as well. So these guys actually do have nerves. They are radially symmetrical. Corals are a little bit harder to see that, but at some point in their life they're going to be radially symmetrical. They have 2 layers, so a little bit more complexity to their tissues, and generally they have a free-floating portion to their life cycle, but corals are going to settle down and spend the rest of their life in one spot, whereas jellyfish are able to move around. Flatworms, so Phylum Platyhelminthes. These guys here, more complex still, so they do have nerves. They're bilaterally symmetrical. So think of them as being our first fully bilaterally symmetrical animals. They have a single opening, most of them, in terms of their digestive system, and so where the food goes in is the same spot where the food comes out. These guys can reproduce through fission, so by having pieces break off of them, or you can actually take them and, so these guys here, lots of people play around in labs with them. They can actually be cut in half, and then both halves are able to survive. Or if you partially cut them in half, then both halves of those are able to survive. So if you cut the head in half, then it actually grows 2 halves. If you cut the tail in half, it'll grow 2 tails. So flatworms and tapeworms. Tapeworms are parasitic. So we do have some that do affect us. They can take up residence within the digestive system of mammals and just feed off the nutrients there. Rotifers, sort of probably one you haven't heard very much of, but these guys are, again, relatively simple. They're aquatic, they are bilaterally symmetrical, and they relatively simple. We won't go into too much detail, but they are an entire phylum within the animal kingdom. Mollusks, these guys for sure you know. So the snails, slugs, octopi, they are all under the Phylum Mollusca. They have fairly complex nervous system, bilaterally symmetrical. They all have shells. An octopus, you don't see the shell, but they do have a small piece of shell within them. And they have a soft, unsegmented body. So getting more and more complex as we go along. And very, very, again, complex nervous system. So octopi are much, much smarter than we probably give them credit for, and are able to do very complex things like mimic other animals, change their colors, change their shapes, change their textures, do all sorts of neat and interesting things. Annelids, these are our worms, and a specifically type, these are our segmented worms. So when you see an earthworm, you can see that it is made up of different segments. You can actually see the segments in its body. And so it has these differentiated segments within its body. They're bilaterally symmetrical, and they're able to grow larger, more complexity because of the way that they're formed in terms of the segmentation and the repeating units within the body. They have a complete digestive system. So you've definitely seen earthworms before. Leeches are also part of the same phylum as earthworms. Obviously, leeches are going to be feeding off of other animals that have blood that they can drink, whereas earthworms are going to be more eating decomposing matter. But many types. Roundworms is another type of worm. If you've heard of nematodes before, these guys are roundworms. Huge, huge, huge amounts of them. Lots of variety within the species themselves, all over the place. They do also have nervous system. They're bilaterally symmetrical. A lot of them are going to be parasitic. Lots of free-living ones as well, but we tend to focus on the parasitic ones, and they do form things like pinworms, which can be fairly common within humans. They like to infect humans and take up humans as their host. Also can form heartworms, so if you have pets at home, that's one thing that you do need to worry about in terms of making sure your pets don't get the heartworms. And there's going to be other types of nematodes that can affect us as well, things that cause river blindness, that these nematodes want to take up residence in our body, and if they take up residence in a place like your eye, they can cause blindness based on that as well. So lots of nasty parasites in this phylum here. Arthropods, another really common one. So you'd be very familiar with these guys. Within them, you're going to think of your insects, but very complex nervous system as well. And they have jointed legs. So if you look at the animal and it has jointed legs and an exoskeleton, it's probably an arthropod. That exoskeleton is made of chitin as well. We saw that with the fungi, but it gives them a hard protective layer. And so it's essentially, they don't have an internal skeleton. They instead have this exoskeleton on the outside. And again, more developed nervous system. And so we have bigger brains with these guys and much more signals being taken in from the environment, much better visual perception through the eyes and chemical perception through antenna as well. So more and more complexity with these. We have then the echinoderms, Echinodermata. Think of these guys as spiny skin is what that name is referring to. They do have nerves, bilaterally symmetrical in youth, but they tend to develop radial symmetry later. So starfish are a common example for this. They are radially symmetrical. The sea urchins, again, if you look at them from the top, they are radially symmetrical. No matter how you divide them through the center, it's going to be the same all the way around. Sea cucumbers fit into this as well. Apparently the radial symmetry can be seen with the structures inside, so it doesn't quite fit in as well for that, but they do fit into this phylum, Echinodermata. No real skeleton, but they do have internal support, and they don't have a head. Then the chordates. So this is our phylum. So kingdom animal, Phylum Chordata. These are going to have the most complexity to them. Again, all of them are bilaterally symmetrical. They are going to have relatively complex, compared to all of the other phylum, relatively complex nervous systems. And all of them, as the name suggests, chordata, all of them have a notochord, essentially a spinal cord. And we tend to see skeletons within these guys as well. So for sure you know the different classes within these. So we have our mammal class, so mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds. You know those as groups of animals. And then probably most people would put the other three classes together as fish, but there are actually three different types of fish, which if you do a further study and classification, you can worry about the differences between those types of fish. But the animal kingdom has this phylum chordata in it, and within the phylum chordata, we essentially have, there really is 7 groups, but we can sort of think of them as being the 5 main groups. The fish group is divided into 3 though.